Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's laboratory session. As MSc Psychology postgraduate students, you're here not just to follow a set of instructions, but to critically analyze the cognitive architecture of the human mind. Today, we're focusing on a truly classic empirical demonstration in experimental cognitive psychology, the serial position curve, also known as the position effect in serial learning. Now, our objective today isn't merely to run an experiment and plot some data points. We are here to deeply understand the underlying cognitive mechanisms responsible for encoding, rehearsal, storage, and retrieval in human memory. Remember this throughout our session today. Interpretation is always more important than simply obtaining the graph. All right, let's get started. Here is our roadmap for today's practical. We'll start with the theoretical foundations, move into our laboratory experiment protocol, examine the serial position curve itself, discuss the interpretation of cognitive mechanisms, look at some real-world applications, and wrap up with the conclusion and your viva voce questions.
Section 1. Theoretical Foundations of Memory. Okay, let's dive right into this by first establishing our theoretical framework.
To understand why a participant remembers certain words and forgets others, we have to start by defining serial learning. This is a learning situation where material is presented in a fixed sequential order, and the learner has to memorize the items in exactly that presentation order. Think about learning the alphabet or memorizing a telephone number. But for today's lab, we're going to study these positional effects using a task called immediate free recall. So, instead of forcing our participants to recite items in strict order, we'll present them serially, but allow them to recall them freely. By doing this, we can isolate exactly how the serial position of an item during presentation influences its probability of being remembered later on. This specific approach is exactly why this experiment became such a foundational demonstration in cognitive psychology.
Sequence learning is a highly complex, multifaceted domain. It involves explicit and implicit learning, sequence prediction, sequence generation, recognition, and sequential decision-making. The order in which information is presented strongly dictates cognitive processing. Memory performance, as you know, is never just a single unitary action. Rather, it reflects the combined contributions of multiple interacting systems, primarily attention, encoding, storage, and retrieval. I want you to keep these interacting systems in mind as we go over the design of our experiment.
Section 2. Laboratory Experiment Protocol. Let's move on and look at how this theory builds into our empirical methodology.
As postgraduate psychology students, observe this carefully. A psychological experiment is only as valid as its controls. Our independent variable today is the serial position of each word within the list, meaning was it presented first, fifth, or 15th. Our dependent variable is the percentage of correctly recalled words at each of those positions. But crucially, look at our controlled variables. We must strictly control the presentation time of each word, the syllabic difficulty of the words, the environmental conditions of the lab, the total recall time, and even the physical distance between the participant and the experimenter. Any variation here introduces confounding variables that will completely invalidate your data. Okay, here are the exact procedural steps you'll follow. First, you'll see your participant comfortably and explain that a list of unrelated words will be presented sequentially. Second, you'll present these standardized words, say apple, then star, then house, one at a time for an equal duration. Typically, that's exactly 1 to 2 seconds per word. Third, the moment the final word is presented, you instruct the participant to engage in immediate free recall, meaning they try to recall as many words as possible in any order. Finally, you'll compile the data, calculate the recall frequency for every single serial position across your trials, and plot this percentage against the serial position to construct your curve. Section 3. The serial position curve. Now, what's really fascinating here is how these strict procedural steps translate into a highly predictable visual representation of human memory. Let's look at the curve itself. When you plot your data, your graph should heavily resemble this classic U-shaped curve. It's actually one of the most reliable findings in all of memory research. Notice the distinct phases. At the beginning of the list, we see a very high probability of recall. As we move into the middle of the list, recall drops significantly. That forms the trough of the U-shape. And finally, at the end of the list, recall probabilities spike dramatically upward again. It's not uniform. Human memory doesn't treat all information equally. It treats information based on its spatial and temporal position in a sequence. Before we move any further, I want you to ask yourselves, why do middle list items suffer such poor recall compared to the extremes? Think critically about what this finding tells us regarding human memory.
If memory were just a single bucket that we pour words into until it's full, the graph would just look like a straight declining line. But it doesn't.
Section 4. Interpretation of cognitive mechanisms. Let's explore the answer to that question.
In research, our objective is always to explain the mechanism underlying the observed behavior, and this curve brilliantly illustrates the dual store model of memory. The enhanced recall of those initial items is known as the primacy effect. Notice how rehearsal changes recall performance here. Because those initial items are presented first, they receive a disproportionate amount of the participant's attention. The participant actually has the time and cognitive capacity to subvocally rehearse those words, efficiently encoding them into long-term memory. Conversely, look at the recency effect, that spike at the end of the list. These final items haven't been rehearsed extensively, but they don't need to be. At the exact moment you say recall, these final words are still currently active in the participant's short-term or working memory. The mechanism is entirely different.
So the crucial piece of the puzzle is understanding the trough, the middle position. Why the severe dip? Well, middle items suffer a dual penalty. First, they're presented after the working memory buffer is already overwhelmed by the initial items, which drastically reduces their opportunities for rehearsal. Second, and highly critical, they are completely sandwiched by interference. They suffer from proactive interference from the early words and retroactive interference from the final words. It's almost the cognitive equivalent of middle child syndrome. They lack both the established long-term encoding of the early items and the immediate working memory presence of the late items, and therefore they get forgotten.
Section 5. Real-world and clinical applications. These laboratory findings aren't merely academic exercises. They have incredibly practical implications.
They have profound, measurable impacts on applying psychology. In the educational sphere, understanding serial position is absolutely vital for instructional design. As future educators or organizational psychologists, you must realize that lengthy, uninterrupted lectures basically guarantee that the information in the middle will be lost to interference. Key concepts must be introduced early to leverage the primacy effect, and then summarized at the end to leverage the recency effect. Shifting context to clinical applications, the serial position curve is a standard tool in neuropsychological assessments. By having a patient perform this exact experiment, a clinical psychologist can evaluate their memory functioning. For example, specific neurological disorders like Alzheimer's disease often produce characteristic predictable deficits in the primacy effect long before the recency effect degrades. This makes our simple word list an incredibly powerful diagnostic tool.
Section 6. Conclusion and viva voce. This brings us to our summary and your discussion preparation. The data you'll collect today provides empirical evidence for the complex interaction between attentional allocation, short-term capacity, and long-term encoding. As your manual states, the serial position curve demonstrates that memory performance is strongly influenced by the order of presentation. It remains one of the foundational experiments in experimental cognitive psychology. It's foundational because it unequivocally proved that human memory is not a single unitary process, but rather a set of dynamic, interacting systems.
I'll leave you with these 5 analytical questions for your viva voce. I expect you to thoroughly explain the mechanisms behind the primacy and recency effects, dissect the exact role of interference in the middle list, and articulate how this curve supports the theory of multiple memory systems. I want you to reflect deeply on these before writing your final report. Ultimately, if our ability to remember our own lives is heavily dictated by the simple order in which events occur, well, how reliable is human memory to begin with? Think about that. Best of luck in the lab today, everyone. Let's get to work.